How's it going, folks? And welcome to this week's mini lecture, the last one for our class, where we discuss fashion in Latin American popular culture. This topic that I will be covering for fashion is on the Maria Montserrat Fiu Lopez article, The U.S. Hispanic Flapper, Pelonas, and Flaperismo in U.S. Spanish language newspapers from 1920 to 1929. And here, what we'll be looking at is how are Latin Americans living in the US? How are they reacting to this flapper trend that is really hitting the globe? But here we see that there's a unique response to the flapper trend in the US from the perspective of many Latin American groups living in the United States. We hear in this article, we hear a lot of perspective from Mexican Americans, but we also hear the perspective of Cuban American authors as well as Puerto Rican authors who are in the media criticizing this trend in which they see it sort of differently. They see it as assimilationist, they see it as a revoking of their culture, of their traditions, but again, sort of ignoring or forgetting the fact that this is a trend that has also swept places like Mexico. It's also swept places like Argentina. Um, and other parts of Latin America, geographic Latin America, as well. And so, with that, let's get into our reading. Now, for starters, before delving into the article, we do need to talk about what are some of the historical and cultural influences that are impacting the popularity of this trend. So, for starters, we learned that flaperismo or the flapper trend it's being impacted by this era we often refer to it as the Roaring Twenties. But this is also a time where jazz music has started to become very popular in the United States. And of course, this is also music that becomes receptive to Latin Americans living in the US. And so, also keeping in mind that the 1920s is this sort of this calm before the storm. It's right before the Great Depression that comes at the end of the decade. But it's during this time where we see lots of increased national prosperity. This is considered the sort of age of consumerism, hence why we call it the Roaring Twenties, and a lot of cultural change happening at this time. So you see a lot more folks being involved in, for example, in the nightclub scene and going out, in intermingling, engaging in relationships, formal relationships, right? That were otherwise disapproved in more conservative rural cultures. And this is also where we start to see an explosion in the entertainment industry, in the arts, as well as in transportation. So we see, especially in the cities, people are more mobile, especially with access to the automobile as well. And so this is a time also where we start to see many young women emulating the flapper trend. And in many ways, the flapper comes to be seen as someone who is the quote, the fun seeking icon of a burgeoning consumer society. This is again a time where jazz music is being broadcast on radio stations and this is a time where many folks are tuning in and dancing, not just in the nightclubs, but even have the ability to tune in and dance from the comfort of their own homes. And so we even see that this is a trend that's being covered in not just the English media, but also in the Spanish speaking media as well, where they're writing about famous flappers such as Clara Bow, Colleen Moore, and Joan Crawford. And again, we see the same thing happening in Latin America as well, right? There's also uh, Mexican film and Mexican cinema is very much attentive to the presence of flappers or flaperas, or less flappers, as they were often called at the time. Um, but what were some of the key characteristics of the flappers? They were known also for their short hair, their bobbed hairstyle, for wearing the stockings, and also more revealing clothing, which also makes them sort of the butt of many of these jokes coming from a sort of chauvinist perspective. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Now, when it comes to popular culture, I think one common thread that we always see happening, whether it's with new music, new forms of entertainment or new forms of communication, there's always that sort of conservative backlash, right? You have folks who are criticizing the culture or the new phenomena for various reasons. And in the case of the flapper phenomena, actually, I have the wrong text here. Let me fix this. You can ignore this short text that I have here on the PowerPoint on the bottom left hand. I was supposed to take out that part that says short poems. Just ignore that. But, anyways, um, so what were some of the commonalities that US and Latin American conservatives, what were some of their commonalities when it came to uh, not just flapper culture per se, but also this these cultural conflicts in general. And so, as far as the image of the flapper, we learned that those in the rural parts of the United States, they did not generally take kindly to this image of the flapper. They valued the idea of women who were homemakers and who practiced traditional morality. And for that matter, this was a time when US society was very much openly chauvinist. And of course, this was a time also where they not only exploited immigrants, but there was also, of course, many nativist movements, and that nativism would, of course, be severely increased as we're getting closer to the Great Depression. We're getting closer also to this age of the Great Repatriation movement happening that emerged during the Great Depression that targets specifically Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Um, and we also have this is also a time in the 1920s where you have these discourses by white American intellectuals who are claiming that Spanish speaking people, more specifically Latin Americans, are impeding the nation's modernization, right? So there's many of these assimilationist campaigns um, that are trying to target Latin American families. And some of them more specifically targeting women from, especially we see this also in Mexican American communities and Puerto Rican communities in places like New York. Uh, and as far as what criticisms came from Spanish language journalists about flappers, we see that some of their criticisms targeted the so-called pelonas or the flappers as, quote, symbols of undignified acculturation and ethnic disloyalty. That's a quote from the author on page 193. They saw flapperismo as assimilation, even though flapperdom, quote unquote, was a global phenomena. And more importantly, they saw flapperismo as a threat to the idea that this view that women should belong in the household and that they should simply be supporting their husbands. So, in the long term, the view of the flapper or the pelona, it was a danger to the traditional Latin American family, and many saw it as this sort of a threat to femininity, right? Their traditional standards of femininity. Um, and what's perhaps also unsettling was that, at least for what was unsettling to these writers, at least these conservative writers, was that they were they feared that, quote, Latinas were also, quote, dancing the Charleston in smoky jazz clubs as any Anglo-American girl would, instead of supporting their husbands and fathers at home, as was expected by Hispanic social custom, end quote. That's by Few Lopez on page 194. Um, and so the weapon that was used by these writers, by these Spanish-speaking writers in the U.S. to target the flapper trend among Latinas was to make a mockery, quote unquote, right, of this social phenomena of the so-called new girl, right? The new girl was this term that was essentially used on the flapper woman, and so this was meant to also not just sort of target uh, or to challenge women engaged in the flapper trend. It was also sort of a nod to men who were readers, right, of these articles that were often written in Spanish, um, who felt threatened by this new flapper trend, and who also felt threatened that many of the women who became flappers were entering the workforce, right? Many saw women entering the workforce as a threat to their masculinity. And more specifically, some of the jobs that maybe they might have been considering were entering in office work, for example, as clerks or in other duties, that these were jobs that were being taken up by women. And in some cases, these women were being paid more, in some cases, viewed as receiving better wages than they were, as we will see in some of the examples in this article. Right, we see examples of insecurities of husbands as depicted in these satirical pieces. And interestingly, right, we see that not only were these anxieties were they represented in newspapers, they were also represented in popular Mexican theater through works like, for example, we see here this is from I believe this is from a Mexico City newspaper, El Universal. Here we have a play, La Esposa Flapper, or The Flapper Wife, that premiered on July 1924. So, who exactly was this the so-called modern girl, and how did she differ from the so-called modern woman? And so, it's important for us to make this distinction because these were two overlapping concepts at the time. And one concept was openly attacked by the conservative Spanish-speaking media, and the same went for the U.S. newspapers as well. I'm sorry, the English-speaking U.S. newspapers. And the other archetype was one that tended to be, if not praised, at least allowed to speak for themselves, the view of the modern woman. But before talking about who were these two, let's talk about who was the so-called modern girl. The modern girl was somebody who was described by U.S. Spanish language newspapers as, quote, la chica moderna, as a girl, as the flapper, and also was referred to by the term pelona interchangeably. So those four terms were often used interchangeably: chica moderna, girl, flapper, and pelona. But to contrast with these women, with the so-called flapper women, or the pelonas, they contrasted them with women who were described as, quote, the mujer moderna, or the modern woman, who was also simply just called mujer, or woman. And they often referred to these women to distinguish them from those who were feminists or defenders of women's rights. But you also have that sort of um, there was this sort of assumption that women who were flappers were not feminists themselves, right? That they were sort of in this own consumerist bubble that did not seem to care much for politics, right? But in reality, this was not always the case. And many of these popular discourses of the flappers, right, we see that they were even embraced by popular writers at the time, such as the Mexican exile Maria Luisa Garza, who went by the pen name Lorelli. We learned that she wrote a chronicle called Las Pelonas in 1922, where she referred to the flappers as, quote, silly girls who made men suffer. Um, and sadly, an important point that's raised here is that we often do not hear from the flappers themselves, right? Flapper women themselves, right? We often do not hear about them in the media. They're not allowed to speak for themselves. I like this quote on page 194, where Few Lopez states that, after all, as Miriam Silverberg put it, the, quote, modern girl was to be seen, the new woman was to be heard. And that's on page 194. Um, there was only a few cases, very rare cases of Mexican flappers being allowed to speak for themselves in these newspapers, in these chronicles. One example being Q Bonifant, or Antonia Bonifant Lopez, who appeared in La Prensa in San Antonio. She was also quoted in El Tucsonense from Tucson, as well as El Heraldo de Mexico in Los Angeles. Uh, and so you have these two sort of dichotomies, right? The modern woman, right? I'm sorry, the modern girl versus the modern woman. And so just to kind of help you distinguish those, the use of girl, right, sort of kind of implies someone who's immature versus woman who's this assumed more developed, more refined individual. So the term modern girl, right, was in a sense meant to be pejorative, whereas the term modern woman was meant to be more reverential, for the lack of a better term. I mean, for the lack of a better characterization. Excuse me, I cannot speak today. So, with this, let's talk about who exactly was Julio G. Arce, one of the folks who's mentioned, one of the central figures mentioned in this reading. So we learned that Julio G. Arce, who was born in the year 1870, he passed in 1926. He was the editor of El Diario del Pacífico and El Diario del Occidente, two newspapers that were published back in Mexico. And these objected to the Mexican status quo, political status quo, but unfortunately for Arce, at some point he was imprisoned during the Mexican Revolution by the armies of Venustiano Carranza because he had made criticisms of the Mexican Revolution. And so, because of his imprisonment, he self exiled to San Francisco, and he would go on to work for La Crónica in San Francisco in the year 1914. And so he went on to become a publisher in 1919. And by then, they had renamed themselves as Hispano America. Um, and they would go on to be one of the most influential and well respected Spanish language weeklies published in San Francisco. Um, and and notably, as for just to speak a little bit on the newspaper, also, a few Lopez notes that Natalie Havlin has pointed out that he and other U.S. Hispanic journalists in San Francisco, quote, contributed to a strategic ethnic consciousness in hopes of producing and mobilizing a political community, end quote, on 195. And so their purpose was to sort of help create this sort of platform for political mobilization, right, and providing a political voice for the Latin American community in the region. And we see also that for those of you who are researchers who are interested in learning more about him, that his work is available digitally via the Recovering U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project. And we learned that he would also use the pseudonym Jorge uh, Ulica in order to write his weekly chronicles called Crónicas Diabólicas, or the Diabolical Chronicles, from the years of 1910 up into the 20s. And there's been other works that have studied his works through the context of how his works helped to spread Mexican nationalism. But also, there have been folks who pointed out how his works often were used to sort of regurgitate and spread patriarchal rhetoric, which is something that we'll be focusing on a bit here. But for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to be looking at sort of just summarizing how does his work. There's three of his works that are mentioned here in this article. He has these three chronicles, uh, which are these fictitious accounts, right, of Pelona life through the perspective of this character that he developed. And one of these is Todo se arregla con money, everything's fixed with money, in 1924. The Things of Exhibition Day, Cosas del Exhibition Day, in 1924. And La Estenógrafa, or The Estenographer, that was published in 1925. And so these three works were trying to draw readers' attention to the dangers of flapper life, well, more specifically, what they represented. And what he's trying to do with these works is trying to sort of disrupt or present them as something that's trying to disrupt the so-called, quote, Hispanic tradition, to quote Vio Lopez here. So I'm not going to go over each of the different works, but I did want to focus here on what are some of the common themes that we see in these three works. Now, a common theme that we see a lot in some of these works is the theme of the so-called emasculated husband, who finds himself emasculated because his wife is at work, and because she's at work, she cannot provide for him. She cannot attend to washing clothes or to cooking to cooking food for the family. And we see this in the first example, the todo se arregla con money, or money solves it all. There's this fictitious character, Don Arturo de la Hacha, who speaks to the character Ulika, and he points out that his wife is working a government job, and complains that no one is attending to the kitchen or mending his socks, and also complains that he feels neglected. And this again moves Ulika. I can never say that name correctly. Forces Ulika to go to her workplace and try to encourage her to be more attentive to her husband. Uh, and and then along and towards the end of this um, this comic, right, or this story or narrative, I should say, not comic, because there was no images here. Um, they both, at some point, both Ulcia as well as the husband who feels that he's being neglected, eventually they go to the workplace, and then he finds his wife kissing her boss. And so when the husband questions the wife about this, she points out that she gets a $10,000 bonus from this to her salary because of this. And so and perhaps in a comical way, the husband embraces his wife, right? And he exclaims that she is the best wife, and to God bless her. And so I think there's an important point made here, as she mentions on page 197, that Arce's farce, right? This exaggerates the consequences of women working outside the home and represents their money making as dishonest. According to the farce, only a deceitful U.S. Hispanic woman would choose to work and for the U.S. government. Consequently, both Miss Acha and her husband have to be publicly chastised in Ulika's diabolical chronicle. Okay, so again, there's this sort of view that flappers are not only immoral people, but this view that they're also engaged in indecent work, and there's sort of this illusion that they're involved in sex work. Um, and there's some of these other stories claim that they are just merely attention seeking with their revealing clothing. Um, and lastly, the last example that I want to point to is this note on how the fabric, according to these folks, uh, to the criticisms, right, of the author, um, of these of Julio Chiarse, is how he views the women engaged in the flapper trend as assimilating, and by assimilating, they're not only challenging male sexual dominance, but also, in a sense, emasculating these men. And the last example that's mentioned in this article, in the story of the stenographer, here we learned about the character again, Ulika. We learned that he hires a stenographer, and a stenographer by the name of Rosie. And we learned that Rosie is a sort of anglicized Latina woman, right? Or presumably, I get the sense that it's supposed to be an anglicized Mexican American woman, who apparently her actual name is Rosa, but in the story she has changed her name to Rosie in order to sort of anglicize her name, and which the author makes fun of her by calling her Mrs. Pink, right? Um, and in a sense here also we get a sense that this story is not just making fun of pelonas for because of their dress, but also claims that they're assimilating, and that by assimilating that they're forgetting their roots. We see that he's also making fun of her for speaking Spanglish, and also making fun of the fact that she mispronounces words or mistranscribes words as part of her job. So one interesting example that's noted here about how her entry into the workforce, how it directly potentially emasculates men, is in this comical example, right? That's given here in the paper. He mentions how the stenographer, that she accidentally alters the word agotado, which means tired, and she changes it to ajotado, or effeminate, right? But the author here translates it as effeminate. It's actually meaner. Ajotado technically would be the equivalent of the English equivalent of um, somebody who's I'm not gonna say it out loud, but the F word, right? The F word for to refer to somebody as a homosexual, right? So and but but add a TED at the end. FTED is the best way for me to translate that, right? Um, and as she best states on page 200, right, she says, Arce's wordplay predicts the inevitable effects of flaperismo on men, that is, their loss of physical and sexual dominance over women. The implication here is that, quote, if the Rosies of America come into office, men are doomed to lose their heterosexuality and its prerogatives. According to Arce, her Americanized immodesty, mixed language, and modern professional expectation threaten conservative Hispanic manhood, end quote, on page 200. Um, and so it's an interesting take, right, on flaperismo here, right? There's this sort of view that, there's not only these frustrations of women dressing differently, and also acculturating. There's also this frustration that it's emasculating, right? That their presence and their ability to sort of um, take charge right over their sexuality and their appearance, and also assert their economic independence is something that's literally perceived as a threat by these men. And the last, some of the last examples that I want to point to here are the artworks that were presented by Alberto O. Faril, right? And sort of it gives us a glimpse into how Latino men are responding, right, to the image of the flappers. So Alberto O. Faril, we learned that he's Cuban. He's a Cuban American writer and also artist in this case, right? And he publishes these images of alleged flappers, right? Um, one of which is comically reading the newspaper he's publishing in El Gráfico. And as you can see, a commonality in each of these images here is it's sort of how it sexualizes flapper women. It depicts them as sort of in these sexually suggestive poses. And the implication here, right, is that the implication is also that they're supposedly engaged in acts that would be associated with dress work, whether it's posing or showing more skin, using more makeup, for example. And so you see this sort of disapproval here, right? They're viewed as engaging in seductive acts or seductive poses, which personally I find ridiculous also because it's like you're accusing them of being seductive, but in some of these images they seem to be they appear to be in the comfort of their own homes. So it's like okay, if they're trying to seduce their husbands, that's different, but it's like if they're living by themselves, whatever. um, I had a lot to say about that, but I don't want to make this video longer than it should be. But and also to give us a sense of how sort of warped or how interesting this mentality was at the time, right? I also like the example given on Figure 5 in this article where it mentions that even as as early as when a pelona is getting up, right, that she's already engaged in and think and engage. She's already thinking about engaging in vice, right? It says here al levantarse, right? That the first thing she does once she gets up, right, is she's already dressed seductively in a seductive pose, but it's like she's at home, folks. um, but it is an interesting sight, right, into this sort of mentality on this depiction of the flappers. And just the last two examples, right? We see here also searching for the fault, buscando el fallo, where it depicts this man down here looking underneath the vehicle. Sort of, it looks like he's trying to inspect the vehicle, but it looks like he's actually inspecting the flapper woman, right? So kind of sort of, I don't want to use this phrase, but I think this is sort of the best way for me to say it is trying to quote mansplain, right? What the problem uh, with the flapper pelona is, and in order to do so, right, he's very very attentively, right, looking at her feet, right, in her sexualized pose. Um, There's also sort of this comical depiction here on the right of the flapper woman by Ofaril, where the caption here reads, "Can you smell it?" Right, and she has her legs open in a very sexually suggestive way, and she's holding some flowers. But the implication here is that she's not asking you about the flowers, and so again, it kind of gives you a sense of how flappers are being imagined as sexually as over sexual beings, right, in many of these depictions in the newspaper. And just, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I just thought it was interesting. It was worth mentioning that these newspapers also published corridos or published news about new corridos that depicted flappers or pelonas. And some of these even have modern depictions today. Interestingly, I learned that some of these corridos actually have modern interpretations today. So some modern corrido artists actually do sing some of these, and some of these have even been adapted into films. This is something that you see a lot with Mexican cinema. After the Mexican Revolution, a lot of the popular corridos at the time get their movie adaptations, or there's movies that are inspired, or 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 sort of take the title of the corrido, right, and include elements of the song within the movie. And perhaps the most common example being their Las Tres Pelonas. But we learned that some of these newspapers published in the U.S., they publish news about some of these corridos, and sometimes they publish the entire lyrics of some of these corridos, such as Las Pelonas, El Vacilón or the Joker, Corrido de los Pescadores, which mentions how apparently these corridos touched on how flapper women or pelonas refused to engage in cotton picking, or did not know how to pick cotton because they were too accustomed to city life. And also last we have the example of "Ya te fuiste y me dejaste," you left and you and you left me alone, right? And it's sort of there's a comical note in that corrido talking about how the flapper woman he was with just left him with nothing but stockings. But just to sort of conclude, right? Because I understand that this article talked to us more about sort of the perception of the flapper, but less about sort of why was this trend popular. But it did talk to us more about why was it scorned. And so this was really one of those articles where to understand why the trend was so popular, I think it's one of these things where we really have to read between the lines and get a sense of and look at what the criticisms are. And I think from there we learn why this trend was so appealing. Um, well, so for starters, why it was scorned, there was this view of it being perceived assimilation. Um, but I think going to answer the question of why the flapper trend was so popular, well, it's what was in at the time, right? It was a popular dress, it was popular fashion, and it was sort of just simply fun, right? We're talking about during the jazz age. If you're going to go to a jazz club, you're going to want to sort of fit into the dress like everyone else, right, is in these dance venues. And so that's what these flapper women did, right? And for Mexican American, Puerto Rican, and Cuban American women, right, who were going to these venues, right, in order to fit in with the crowds, right, they're going to fit in and dress as flappers. And so it fits within this larger spectrum of youth and consumer culture, right, of the roaring 1920s, right. So that to be part of that era, you must engage, right, in its popular trends. Um, and I think there's also keeping in mind that there's a lot of criticism, right, coming from patriarchs, right, from the Mexican patriarchs, the Cuban patriarchs, Puerto Rican patriarchs. This tells us that flapper culture and the way that it's bringing women together, it's bringing them in a way that's allowing them to sort of leave the household, so encouraging them to become more independent. In a sense, right, we could say that it symbolizes that kind of independence, right? And just for them, and gives them a way to sort of new avenues for self-expression, right? So no longer wearing those long Victorian dresses that cover their entire arms that do not allow them to show any skin whatsoever. The um, flapper dress, right, allows them to show more skin, gives them greater avenues for self-expression and movement, right? Because those long Victorian dresses, right, could restrict your movement. Um, and just lastly, right, it was something that could have been considered fun. So I just leave you with those notes talking about sort of the significance of flapper culture and the dress and the trends. And I hope that this will help you think about uh, how fashion intersects with ideas of gender and also with Latin American popular culture as a whole, and how something that could be seen as so subversive when it comes to gender relations. Something so controversial can be viewed as something that's also a source of liberation for some. So thank you, and I will see you all in the next one or whenever I see you again. Thank you, and have a great rest of your summer.